And welcome to part 6, where I'm forging ahead with this painting. I'm starting to see the finish line, so I'm starting to pick up the pace. I'm understanding the needs of the painting. I know exactly where I'm going with it. No need for any more pencil work. The colours are a lot bolder here at the bottom section of the painting, so I can go straight in with some pastel sticks, lay down some colour. I thought it would be a good idea to have a sort of mishmash of greens as a base tone, so I'm just laying them in here. I'll smooth them all, bed them in as I call it, bed them into the pastel mat surface, and on top of that we can start thinking about the structure of the various plants and vines and things that are going to exist in this bottom half of the painting. There wasn't any information on my reference photos for this lower part of the jungle, so once again I'm just ad-libbing it and just imagining what these lower bushes would look like. Just loosely drawing in sort of leaves and things. Nothing has to be too precise, too tidy. Everything is able to be manipulated and blended, rubbed out even if I'm not happy with it. So pastels is a very fluid medium really when you work this way. You can experiment with things, you can just put the base layer down, then you can just try things out. If you don't like them, you just rub them out, try something else. It's a very dynamic way of working. I think pastels is an excellent medium for something like this. Notice how I'm making leaves here by just using the black to do a little triangle shape, and then that green on top just to bring out the shape of a leaf. It's a very light touch, it's a very light layer, so I'll put it there. I can look at it and see if I like it, then I'll put some more on. If I don't, I'll just blend it in, it'll become part of the background. As I say, a very fluid way of working. What you see me doing here again is dealing with edges. I'm trying to separate the bush that's more detailed from the bit underneath that I haven't tackled yet. I'm trying to create that boundary in my mind so I can separate it from that area and concentrate fully on this lower part, which is going to be a little bit back from these foreground leaves above it. So I'm just using the black over the base layer to just draw in my ideas really, and I'll take it from there. I sort of step back every now and then, have a look at it, and give it some thought. It's always a good idea to step back and have a good look at your work rather than just blundering ahead without any judgment. I've heard people say it's 1 minute on the canvas and 2 minutes looking at it, and that's probably the way it should be. I step back, spend quite a bit of time evaluating, deciding whether I like the way it looks, and if I do, then I'll switch my attention over to another section and bring that up to the same level. People often ask whether I have a set order of whether I go background to foreground or start at one side and work to another. I don't really. I just intuitively go from piece to piece, whatever draws my attention, whatever I can feel that I can give it my full attention, and it's the bit I'm most interested in at that particular moment. If you're doing something that you're excited about doing, you're going to do a better job. So that's the only thing that guides me. I am, of course, in a general sense, still working top to bottom though. It's just that wherever I work on a painting, it's whatever I feel like working, because that is where I'll work best at that particular time. Being right-handed, it might actually have made more sense to have worked from left across the painting to the right, but I was more attracted to those fancy leaves near to the main subject, so that's where I went first. And really I've gone from the main focus of the painting down to the secondary focus. Once again, a soft pastel base in this area, and then what I'm doing here is just using a pencil just to tidy the edges around the bird. You're seeing a lot of this painting on a very large scale, probably on your computer screens and your television screens, but in reality it's very, very small, so I've got to go in very finely with the pencil around the edges here. Everything is on a much smaller scale than you might be looking at it, so bear that in mind. So what I've decided to do here is, rather than complete the bird, I've decided to put the background in first around the bird. I think that would be better. I mean, this hornbill here is the secondary point of focus. It's not, it's nowhere near as important as the primary bird over to the right, but nevertheless it has to say something. It has to describe a bit of the depth of the rainforest here. This bird is swooping downwards through the canopy, so although it's going to be far less sort of detailed in its rendering, it's still very important. But before I can add any of the final touches to it, I decided it would be a much better idea to get everything around it done and then return to it at a later stage. So this is what I'm doing now. The usual technique, the base layer with the soft pastel, which was a Winsor & Newton incidentally. So a layer of that, and now the drawing phase. I'm just drawing in the shapes of everything. I'm using the black and a very sort of dark brown there just to draw out all the shapes of the bushes, and then, just as with previous areas, going in with the highlights, and of course accent colours will follow. This is a Conte, a green Conte pastel pencil that I'm using, which I quite liked for this section. I thought it was it just had the right colour and tone to it. And there we see the accent colours going in. Another Conte pastel pencil here, it looks like. A warm orange. I wanted to distinguish between the foreground bushes and the bushes that were further away with colour. And so I was using a lot of blues and purples in the distant bushes and a lot of oranges just to warm up the greens in the bushes that were nearer to the eye. And adding a little bit to the base layer. I think this is a little piece of Henri Roche pastel. Very, very powerful pastels they are. So I'm just putting a little bit here just to indicate the shadow areas of the bushes on a larger scale where there are big blocks of shadow. If I can get those in place, then we can move in and look at things on a smaller scale and put in some more details. But first of all, blocking in those base layer colours before we can move in with that detail. Oh dear, my Conte pencil seems to be getting a little bit shorter, doesn't it? Probably because I'm sharpening it very well and very often. But that could be a little bit of a problem if I run out. I may have to think of an alternative. So after adding a few highlights up here, I turn my attention back to this lower section. Now I'm using the pencil just to draw lots and lots of little leaf shapes. It could really drive you crazy, that. But on the good side, the base colour is colouring the leaves. It's already there. So all I'm doing is just drawing little leaf shapes, and lo and behold, it actually starts to be well on the way to looking a bit like a leaf-filled jungle bush. And just like magic, the more of that background we get in down there, the more the bird seems to be hovering above it. We're creating that space in which the bird is going to be flying over. And one of the ways we're creating that space is by keeping our colours and tones muted. There's a bit of atmosphere between the bird and those bushes. So we're throwing it back a bit. Nothing is too bold in what I'm doing. I know I'm using the black, but there'll be lots of colour skimmed over the top. It's not going to be too bright, because the bird is the thing that wants to stand out in that section. Oh, and look, my alternative to the Conti pencil has arrived in the form of I think it's a Faber Castell square pastel stick. Quite a good choice because it's a very powerful pastel, so it's going to make a nice bright mark, but of course not too bright because it is in the distance. Artists always have to be a little bit careful with greens. Greens tend to leap forward in a painting, and you need to be careful. If your greens are too vivid, they look less natural and therefore less real, so you do need to be careful with that. And here comes some of those atmospherics. I'm just adding this pale purpley bluish colour just to throw everything back, for that same reason that I was saying. The bird needs to look like he's hovering through air and space above this jungle. So I'm just using these bluish tones in the shadow areas just to take everything back a little bit, create some separation between the bird and the forest. It's bringing back memories for me when I do this painting. It's reminding me of what it was like to be stood there in that very hot and steamy jungle. It was the first thing in the morning. I was actually living in a tree house, which was sounds fantastic, but it was actually horrendous because it was full of the most appalling insects you can imagine. At one point I had a whole nest of green ants migrating from one side of my bed to the other, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. Whatever obstacle you put in their way, they just go over it and insist on crossing over you and biting you. It was that aspect of living in the jungle was pretty bad. But this painting is reminding me of the absolute beauty of just climbing down from that tree house and standing in that magnificent rainforest and just seeing the sun rising, seeing those shafts of light come into the jungle. And it was so incredibly hot and steamy, and so the atmosphere that I'm putting in with those blues is really there to represent that humid, hot atmosphere. I want to try and convey that in this painting. I feel that in the top of the painting I've certainly got it, but I want to also balance that with some references to it at the bottom of the painting also. Looking back at me working here, you can see I'd started to relax a little bit with the painting. I was getting a bit looser there at the bottom. It's good to go in quite relaxed at the beginning and then gradually gain control. Some people And I learned this from teaching people. Some people are very tight and very uptight right from the beginning, and it holds them back. People are so slow because they don't loosen up. You can afford to loosen up at the beginning, unless what you're doing is extremely complex and you've got to follow every little detail. Most things, even this jungle, you don't have to do that. So you can speed things along. And it's important to speed things along, because if you don't work efficiently and speedily, you can easily get bogged down, and in the long run you'll burn out. So relax a little, have fun, and gradually gain control towards those finishing touches in a painting. If you look from left to right, you can see various stages of the development here. Over on the left, we've just got a raw base coat, and then as we move sort of diagonally upwards towards my hand, you can see little stages of moving towards completion. And so where I'm working now, I'm just taking it that little step further. I'm looking at all those rough shapes that I made for leaves, and I'm just refining them. I'm just moving in and thinking, yeah, a little bit of shadow in there would be a good thing, and I could refine this one. It's not like I plan out every leaf, but when I get to this stage and I look at each little section, I can sort of imagine it. I can say, yeah, and imagine these leaves just tilting over this way and that way, maybe just put a little bit of shadow here, and I'm just increasing the complexity, increasing the detail, and just bringing it to that stage where all it will need is a little bit of accent colour maybe, and a few highlights, and then we'll have a very convincing looking piece of the jungle. It's all about style as well when you paint something like this. I'm not really trying to recreate the photograph or, you know, make something photographically real. Although that's a tremendous skill, this hyperrealism, but it can be a little bit on the boring side, to be honest, when you look at it, compared to something that's been rendered with a bit of style. I like to see something and know that it's not a photograph, it's something that the human mind has created and the human hand has made it. So I like it to look a little bit stylized. I want to put my own stamp on this. I mean, I am, I guess, a very detailed painter, but I wouldn't like to think I'm real to the point of being photorealistic. I don't really want that. I still want to have a bit of artistic style to this. I don't want people just to confuse it for a photograph. So I'm mindful of that. It's the degree of realism, you know, you have to balance it like you're balancing everything else in a painting like this. And we're moving slowly and steadily towards the goal, which would be where everything was balanced and everything was in harmony, and at that point we would sign it. And let's not forget that realism in itself takes on many forms. It's subjective. Photorealism is only one aspect of realism. A painting can be more real than a photographically real painting. And I suppose that's the goal. It's not photorealism, but something that puts you in that place. It might be an emotional quality as well. It could be if it reminds you of something. That brings a certain reality with it, doesn't it? So the goal isn't always photorealism. That's far from my mind. I'm trying to connect with people in many, many other ways, using colour, using atmosphere, using emotional content in a painting, all these ways to get an emotional and human response out of the person who stands before your painting. And let's face it, they're either moved by it or they're not. And successful paintings are those paintings that can move people. That's the type of reality that we're interested in. I always think that photorealism speaks to the intellect, but other forms of realism, like clever use of colour that might trigger a memory, or the expression in a face on a portrait, they speak to the heart, and I think that's more important for a painting. It's certainly what moves people to want to own a painting, but I think very few people would like to own a painting just because they're impressed with it. No, people buy paintings because they're moved in some way by what the artist has done. And I really do think that that is and should be your goal.